What Vikings did to war brides after victory feasts was more depraved than you imagine in the flickering light of victory fires that danced across the rough-hewn walls of Viking mead halls, where ale flowed freely and warriors recounted their conquests in boastful songs. There unfolded rituals of celebration that concealed acts of depravity so systematic and calculated that they transformed moments of triumph into prolonged nightmares for the most vulnerable victims of Norse expansion. When the last toast had been drunk and the final saga verse sung, these war brides faced ordeals that revealed the darkest aspects of Viking warrior culture, ceremonies of domination that went far beyond simple conquest to encompass deliberate psychological destruction designed to break not only individual spirits but entire cultural identities through the most intimate forms of ritualized humiliation. This is the investigation into the systematic abuse of war brides following Viking victory celebrations, practices that expose how Norse warrior culture transformed military success into elaborate ceremonies of sexual violence and cultural annihilation that served both as rewards for successful raiders and as demonstrations of absolute power over conquered peoples. Through examination of archaeological evidence from feast halls across Scandinavia, contemporary accounts from both Norse and foreign chroniclers, analysis of legal codes governing post-battle conduct, skeletal remains that bear witness to systematic abuse, and the coded testimonies hidden within saga literature, we uncover the horrifying truth about what happened to captured women after the public celebrations ended and the real brutality began. Today, we explore the transformation of military victory into ritualized sexual violence, examining how Viking feast halls became theaters for the systematic degradation of war brides, the ceremonial aspects of their abuse that served to reinforce warrior hierarchies, the long-term psychological and physical consequences for victims, and the ways in which these practices were integrated into Norse religious and cultural frameworks that justified extreme cruelty as divine reward for battlefield success. Drawing upon evidence from excavated feast halls at sites like Gudme in Denmark, Uppsala in Sweden, and numerous Norwegian royal centers, along with analysis of drinking vessels, ceremonial weapons, and architectural modifications designed to facilitate these brutal celebrations, we reveal how Viking victory culture systematically weaponized sexual violence as both entertainment and religious ritual. The archaeological evidence from Viking feast halls reveals architectural modifications and specialized artifacts that suggest the systematic abuse of war brides was not spontaneous violence, but carefully planned ceremonial activity that required specific preparations and dedicated spaces within these centers of Norse social life. Excavations at major feast hall complexes show evidence of secured chambers adjacent to main celebration areas, specialized restraint devices crafted by skilled metalworkers, and modifications to building layouts that allowed for the orchestration of elaborate ceremonies involving multiple participants and audiences. The discovery of ceremonial drinking horns decorated with explicit imagery and specialized furniture designed to facilitate abuse indicates that Viking communities invested considerable artistic and economic resources in creating the material culture necessary for these ritualized violations. The timing and structure of post-victory celebrations created systematic opportunities for the abuse of war brides that were integrated into the normal rhythms of Norse military culture, with specific ceremonial phases that escalated from public humiliation during communal feasts to private ordeals that could last for days or weeks following initial victories. Contemporary legal codes from Iceland and Norway contain detailed provisions governing the distribution and treatment of war brides following successful raids, including specific regulations about which warriors had rights to particular captives and how the ceremonial abuse of these women should be conducted to maximize both individual pleasure and collective demonstration of Norse superiority over conquered peoples. The hierarchical nature of Viking warrior society created complex systems for determining access to war brides during victory celebrations, with the most elaborate and prolonged abuse reserved for the highest-ranking captives while establishing clear protocols for how different levels of warriors could participate in these ceremonial violations. Saga literature, when analyzed for historical rather than romantic content, reveals detailed descriptions of feast hall ceremonies where captured queens and noble women were subjected to particularly elaborate forms of ritualized abuse that served to demonstrate the complete overthrow of their previous social status while providing entertainment that reinforced the military hierarchy among Norse warriors. The religious dimensions of war bride abuse during victory feasts connected these practices to Norse spiritual beliefs about the relationship between military success and divine favor, with the systematic violation of captured women serving as both thanksgiving offerings to war gods and demonstrations of the cosmic order that placed Norse warriors at the apex of human society. Archaeological evidence from religious sites associated with feast halls shows clear connections between areas used for the abuse of captives and spaces dedicated to the worship of Odin and other deities associated with war and conquest, suggesting that these brutal ceremonies were understood as sacred activities that strengthened the spiritual bonds between warriors and their patron gods. The seasonal timing of major military campaigns created periods of intensified abuse for war brides, as the return of raiding expeditions during harvest festivals and winter solstice celebrations provided occasions for elaborate victory feasts that could last for weeks and involved the systematic rotation of captured women among different groups of warriors in ceremonies that combined religious observance with prolonged sexual violence. Contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers describe these extended celebrations as periods of such extreme brutality that even hardened monastery scribes struggled to find language adequate to describe the systematic nature of the abuse they witnessed or heard reported by survivors. The economic aspects of war bride abuse during victory feasts included their use as rewards for military service, with the right to participate in their violation serving as compensation for warriors whose battlefield performance had earned recognition from military leaders. Legal texts reveal detailed frameworks for determining how access to captured women should be distributed among raiding party members, with specific provisions for how long individual warriors could abuse particular captives and how the ceremonial violation of high-status war brides should be shared among the most successful fighters to maintain unity and morale within Norse military forces. The psychological warfare dimensions of these victory celebrations extended beyond their immediate victims to terrorize entire populations through detailed accounts of war bride abuse that were deliberately spread to neighboring communities as warnings about the fate that awaited resistance to Viking expansion. Contemporary chronicles from monasteries across Europe describe how detailed reports of these post-victory ceremonies served as powerful tools of intimidation that often caused settlements to surrender without fighting rather than risk subjecting their women to the systematic brutality that had become synonymous with Viking conquest. The documentation of resistance efforts by war brides during these victory celebrations reveals both the desperate measures they employed to preserve some semblance of dignity and the increasingly sophisticated methods their captors developed to prevent escape, suicide, or any form of defiance that might diminish the entertainment value of their systematic abuse. Legal codes contain specific penalties for war brides who attempted to resist their ceremonial violation, including provisions for escalated punishment that could extend abuse over longer periods or involve larger numbers of participants as consequences for defiant behavior. The medical evidence preserved in skeletal remains from women buried in contexts associated with Viking feast halls provides stark physical testimony to the systematic nature of the abuse inflicted upon war brides during victory celebrations, with patterns of injuries that reveal not only the violence of individual assaults, but the cumulative physical toll of prolonged ceremonial abuse that often resulted in permanent disability or death. Bone analysis shows evidence of specific types of trauma consistent with the ritualized violence described in contemporary accounts, including fractures, tissue damage, and signs of systematic torture that continued well beyond the initial victory celebrations. The international scope of war bride abuse during Viking victory feasts created networks of shared trauma that connected communities across medieval Europe through the systematic violation of their captured daughters, wives, and sisters in ceremonies that were designed to demonstrate Norse cultural superiority while destroying the social bonds that held conquered societies together. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in papal and royal archives reveals how knowledge of these practices influenced international relations and military strategies, with European kingdoms developing specific defensive measures designed to prevent the capture of high-born women who would face particularly elaborate abuse during Viking victory celebrations. The artistic and literary documentation of war bride abuse required sophisticated forms of coded language and symbolic representation, as direct descriptions of systematic sexual violence posed political and religious dangers for skalds and chroniclers who needed to preserve historical truth while avoiding accusations of blasphemy or encouraging similar behavior among their audiences. Analysis of Viking Age poetry and saga literature reveals complex systems of metaphorical language that allow detailed accounts of these brutal ceremonies to be preserved within seemingly heroic narratives that celebrated military achievement while documenting the systematic violation of conquered women. The gradual transformation of these practices during the later Viking Age reflected changing military technologies and political structures that made large-scale raiding less profitable, while the Christianization of Scandinavia created new ideological frameworks that gradually discouraged the most extreme forms of ceremonial abuse. Though modified versions of these practices continued well into the High Medieval period in areas where traditional Norse warrior culture maintained its influence over social and religious customs. The children born as consequences of war bride abuse during victory celebrations occupied particularly complex positions within post-conquest societies, as their mixed heritage made them living reminders of their mother's systematic violation, while potentially providing pathways to improved status if they were acknowledged by their Norse fathers. Legal codes reveal detailed provisions for determining the status and inheritance rights of children born from ceremonial rape, with their legitimacy often depending entirely on their mother's survival and their father's willingness to acknowledge paternity after the conclusion of victory celebrations. The long-term psychological consequences for war brides who survived these victory celebrations included not only the immediate trauma of systematic abuse, but the ongoing challenge of living within societies that celebrated their violation as legitimate expressions of military success and divine favor. Contemporary accounts suggest that many survivors developed complex psychological responses that allowed them to function within their new circumstances while preserving some connection to their previous identities, though the documentation of these coping strategies remains fragmentary and filtered through the perspectives of their oppressors. The legacy of war bride abuse during Viking victory feasts extended far beyond its immediate victims to influence the development of European attitudes toward warfare, conquest, and the treatment of civilian populations in ways that normalized sexual violence as an acceptable consequence of military success. The systematic nature of these practices and their integration into religious and cultural frameworks created precedents that influenced military conduct and civilian victimization patterns throughout the medieval period and beyond. As we examine this darkest aspect of Viking victory culture, we confront uncomfortable truths about how military success has historically been transformed into opportunities for systematic sexual violence that serve both as reward for fighters and as demonstration of absolute power over conquered peoples. The war brides who suffered during these brutal victory celebrations faced ordeals that combined individual trauma with collective cultural destruction in ways that were designed to break not only their personal spirits, but the social bonds that connected them to their previous communities and identities. The story of these women reminds us that behind every narrative of military triumph lies a corresponding tale of systematic violation and cultural annihilation that was deliberately concealed within heroic accounts of warrior achievement, and that understanding the true cost of historical conquest requires us to acknowledge how victory celebrations have often served as theaters for some of history's most systematic and devastating forms of gender-based violence.